Hi, welcome to Chem with Go. Today we're going to take a look at naming ionic compounds. And what you need to remember when we're naming ionic compounds, which is different than naming molecular compounds, is that we don't use prefixes to actually identify the quantity of each one of the ions in the name. And we also go ahead and make sure that, much like naming molecular compounds, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we actually name the last part of the name with an IDE suffix. So if we're going to take a look at this ionic compound, which you're very familiar with, the name would come from the names of the ions that are present in the compound. So let's go ahead and name this. Obviously Na is sodium. Okay, and then instead of having chlorine, what we do is we drop the INE and replace it with an IDE, so this becomes sodium chloride. Alright, so easy so far. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. If we have CaF2 to name this compound, remember, since we're naming ionic compounds, we don't use the prefixes. We could just name it according to whatever the ions' names would be. So simply, this would be calcium, and then this will be fluoride. And notice the ending again has changed. Instead of it having an INE ending, this actually has an IDE ending. Well, let's take a look at another example. Alright, so let's take a look at Al2O3. So this name would be aluminum. And then instead of oxygen, we drop the - igen and make this oxide. Alright, simple enough. Now, a couple of things to note, that ionic compounds are called ionic compounds because of the way they actually form the bonds. One way to identify, just from the formula, okay, to tell whether or not it is an ionic compound or not, is that if you actually have a metal and a non-metal bonded together. So notice that this is a metal, this is a metal. So it's always going to be a metal bonded to a non-metal. Now there are times when we have multiple non-metals actually forming a polyatomic ion. So note that that's the reason why I put an S right there. So again, the way to identify from the formula whether or not this is an ionic compound or not, one way to tell is to see if it's made of a metal and a non-metal, and therefore you know it is an ionic bond. There are more sort of detailed ways to actually tell when we talk about electronegativity and so forth, differences, but for our purposes in this class, the only thing we really need to understand is that whether or not it's a metal or a non-metal. Alright, and I'll see you guys in class.